For decades, you have been taught a grand, tragic story. The British Empire, the empire where the sun never set, did not fall. It was slowly, systematically poisoned from within. You picture the fall as a series of great, dramatic events: the rise of America, the two world wars, the independence movements across India and Africa. But these are just the symptoms of the illness. They are the barbarians at the gate, but the real killer was always inside the treasury, inside the marble halls of power, wielding a weapon far more silent and corrosive than any military force: institutional corruption through financial manipulation. This is not a story about external conquest. It's a terrifying lesson about how the very foundations of economic stability can be surrendered by those sworn to protect them, and how the collapse of an empire is not a sudden crash, but a slow, decades-long transfer of wealth and power from the people to the state. The truth is, the internal betrayal started not with a political scandal, but with a deliberate, calculated decision to destroy the integrity of its own money, a mistake that every modern government is still repeating today. Think about your own life right now. Do you feel the ground shifting? Do you see the price of everything rising while your own savings feel trapped in a system that seems rigged? The anxiety you feel is not new. It is the echo of the same economic desperation that first cracked the foundation of the largest empire the world had ever known. If you understand how they killed the British Empire, you will understand the threats facing your own future today. The illusion began with the gold standard. From the early 19th century, the British pound sterling was the anchor of global finance. It was better than gold. It was gold. The promise was that for every pound note in circulation, there was a specific, tangible amount of gold held in the vaults of the Bank of England. This simple, ironclad rule was the source of Britain's power. Trust in the pound was trust in the system. And trust in the system allowed Britain to finance global trade, build railways across continents, and enforce its will with an almost supernatural economic authority. It was the epitome of a sound money system. But the moment the first shell was fired in the summer of 1914, that foundation began to crumble. World War I was not just a war of trenches and tanks, it was a war of finance. And no war of that scale can ever be financed honestly. The cost of mobilizing the entire empire, of sustaining millions of men on the Western Front, of buying munitions from the United States, it was a sum that dwarfed the empire's total gold reserves. The political choice was brutal. Either admit the empire could not afford the war, a politically suicidal move, or quietly, strategically, dismantle the financial system that guaranteed its integrity. They chose the latter. Within weeks of the war's declaration, the UK government suspended the gold standard for banknotes. This was the first lethal dose of slow poison. It was disguised as an emergency measure, a temporary necessity to save the nation. But what it really did was give the government, and more critically the Bank of England, a license to print. It replaced real money backed by metal with fiat money backed only by the promise of the state. It was a blank check. A new terrifying reality emerged. The government no longer had to tax its citizens directly and honestly for all the war's costs. Instead, they could finance the war through debt and through inflation. The silent, hidden tax that robs the common person of their savings without them ever seeing the invoice. The narrative of sacrifice was everywhere. Propaganda posters urging men to enlist, women to work, and citizens to buy war bonds. This was the second layer of the poison. The government borrowed unprecedented amounts from its own citizens, appealing to patriotism to convert private wealth into public debt. This mass mobilization of private capital created a colossal mountain of internal debt that would become the empire's financial shackles for the next century. It was an ingenious, ruthless trick. The people gave their savings to the state to fight a war, And in return, the state gave them back paper promises, promises that were now backed by a currency that the state itself had just gained the power to debase at will. The attempt to return to the gold standard in 1925, spearheaded by Churchill, was a desperate, misguided attempt to reverse the poison. But it was too late. The brief flirtation with fiat printing had already inflated prices and salaries. To return to the gold parity of 1914 meant the pound was now catastrophically overvalued. British exports became too expensive, sinking the economy into a deep depression. The financial integrity of the empire had been sacrificed on the altar of war financing and political vanity, leaving behind a nation chained by debt and a currency that was now a weapon against its own people. This debt machine, perfected during World War I, was then weaponized against the empire's own components during World War II. The cost of the Second War led to the US introducing the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, an act that saved Britain militarily, but was a financial takeover dressed as aid, permanently shifting the center of global economic power from London to Washington. But the most insidious form of corruption was the creation and manipulation of the sterling area debt, often referred to as the sterling balances. Countries like India and Egypt were compelled to sell their goods and resources to the UK for sterling credits rather than gold or dollars. They were forced to finance the UK's war effort. By the end of the war, Britain owed its former colonies a staggering sum, over £3.5 billion, a sum that dwarfed the UK's total reserves. This debt, primarily owed to nations like India, was the collateral damage of imperial finance. It was an internal expropriation, forcing one part of the empire to bankroll the financial survival of the core. The subsequent political strategy was the core corruption itself. Instead of paying the debt, the British government spent decades trying to negotiate delay and devalue it effectively, using inflation and currency manipulation to pay its imperial debts with increasingly worthless pounds. This financial act undermined the moral and economic trust necessary to hold the empire together, making the final political collapse of the empire an absolute certainty. This is the truth that history books never focus on. This is the moment the most powerful empire in history began its long, deliberate, self-inflicted demise. The slow poison was working perfectly. The slow poison culminated in the Suez Crisis of 1956. This event is often taught as a geopolitical failure, but the real lesson is purely financial. When the UK and France invaded the United States through the Eisenhower administration, issued a devastating threat. America would sell its vast holdings of sterling debt, effectively crashing the pound sterling and bankrupting Britain immediately. This threat was not military, it was a financial execution. The UK had to withdraw within days. Suez was the moment the British Empire discovered it was no longer a sovereign power, but a financial vassal. The ultimate control over the former empire now rested not in London, but in the hands of the nation that controlled the debt and the global currency, the United States. The empire did not merely cede territory, it surrendered its own balance sheet, a surrender engineered by decades of internal financial trickery and the abandonment of sound money principles. The collapse of the British Empire was a masterclass in this deception. It demonstrates that political power follows financial strength, and financial strength is only possible with a sound, uncorruptible currency. The final, crucial lesson is that the poison they used to annihilate the empire did not disappear. It was merely refined, repackaged, and adopted by the new global powers. The internal corruptions of the 20th century are now the foundational operating system of the 21st. The ghost of the British Empire's collapse is haunting your bank account right now. Consider the patterns. The political strategy of financing war and social promises through debt and inflation became the standard global playbook by 1971, when President Nixon officially ended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, completing the global transition to a system of pure fiat money, the very system that first began to poison the pound. Every Western government now operates with the license to print and borrow, just as the Bank of England did in its darkest hours. This means that the biggest, most complex form of institutional corruption is the normalized debasement of your savings. You are paying a silent, invisible tax every day. The downfall of the British Empire offers us three surgical necessary lessons for your financial survival today. First, never trust a currency that can be expanded at will. The moment money is no longer tied to an external, scarce and physical anchor, it becomes a tool of state power and financial trickery. Second, the debt is the master, not the servant. The massive debt accumulated by the UK government ultimately defeated the empire itself, making it subservient to its creditors. Governments do not escape their debts. They either pay them through taxes or they default on them through inflation. The choice is never if the bill will be paid, only how you, the common person, will be forced to pay it. Third, knowledge is your only sovereign asset. The common British citizen was ignorant of the high-stakes financial battles being fought in the Treasury. They trusted the government's rhetoric while the value of their savings quietly eroded. Your own economic future depends entirely on your ability to see the system not as a benign protector, but as a complex machine designed to concentrate wealth upward. The empire did not die from a clean wound. It died from the slow internal rot of its own paper promises. That future, which they mortgaged away, is the financial reality you are now living inside. The only question left is, will you repeat the same mistake of trusting the illusion, or will you use this harsh, necessary truth to protect yourself from the poison that is still being dispensed today?